So, what's the real deal with the US-India relationship? Is it a genuine friendship between equals? Or, as the source material for this explainer argues, is the US more of a clever enemy? Someone who gives you a hug while stabbing you in the back? Let's dive into the case it presents.
Okay, just imagine this for a second. You invite a guest over to your house. You welcome them in, show them respect, and then, right on your doorstep, one of your so-called friends attacks them. I mean, how would you feel? Wouldn't that feel like a massive slap in the face? A direct hit on your own self-respect?
Well, this is exactly the kind of scenario our source material uses to frame a pretty recent event. It points to the mysterious sinking of an Iranian warship out in the Indian Ocean. Now, this ship wasn't just passing through, it was India's guest for a naval exercise. And the prime suspect, according to the source, a U.S. submarine. The argument here is that this was way more than just a ship sinking. It was a calculated blow to India's credibility on the world stage.
And that one incident really forces us to ask the central question of this whole investigation. When we look at the United States, are we looking at a friend or a very clever enemy?
Now, according to the thinking here, the message behind this alleged attack was just as important as the act itself. It was supposedly designed to scream to the world, hey, look, India can't even protect guests in its own backyard, and to make it crystal clear that the real power in the Indian Ocean is Washington. But maybe the weirdest part of it all, the source points to the total official silence from the Indian government, which it suggests is a sign of some serious behind-the-scenes pressure.
So you might think, okay, maybe this is a one-off incident. But not according to this analysis. It claims these suspicions aren't new at all. They're rooted in a long and, frankly, pretty troubling history. Let's take a look at the historical pattern this source says it's uncovered. Let's wind the clock all the way back to 1966. In the span of just 13 days, India loses its prime minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri, under really strange circumstances. Then, boom. Just 13 days later, Dr. Homi Bhabha, the father of India's entire nuclear program, dies in a mysterious plane crash. The source puts forward a pretty startling theory that these two deaths so close together were no accident, but a coordinated operation.
And the motive for this alleged operation? Simple. To cut the head off India's leadership, stop its nuclear ambitions dead in their tracks, and make absolutely sure that India would have to rely on the West for its security for decades.
This aggressive attitude, the source argues, became terrifyingly real in 1971. While India was stepping in to stop a genocide in what would soon become Bangladesh, the U.S. didn't send help. No, it sent its nuclear-armed 7th Fleet steaming into the Bay of Bengal. The source uses this as a prime example, saying, look, this wasn't a hand of friendship, it was a nuclear gun pointed right at India's chest.
All right, let's fast forward a bit. The source claims this pattern of trying to undermine India didn't just stop in the 70s. Oh no! It just changed tactics, focusing instead on sabotaging India's efforts to become technologically and militarily independent.
By the time we get to the 1990s, India is once again trying to develop its nuclear program. And the source claims the U.S. basically threw the kitchen sink at them to stop it. We're talking intense surveillance, major diplomatic opposition, and when India finally succeeded with its nuclear tests, the U.S. led the global charge to hit it with crippling economic sanctions.
And to really drive this point home, the source asks us to look at this tale of two fighter jets. On one hand, you have India's homegrown Tejas fighter. Right when it needed US-made engines, the supply was suddenly cut off. At the very same time, the US was pouring millions of dollars into maintaining Pakistan's F-16 fleet, a fleet, the source argues, that really only has one primary target, India.
Okay, so that brings us pretty much up to today. The argument is that the tools have changed. We've moved from military threats to more subtle economic and geopolitical pressure, but the goal? The goal has stayed exactly the same.
Remember when the Trump administration was labeling countries? Well, the source claims it slapped tariffs of up to 50% on Indian goods. And the reason it alleges? It was basically punishment because India was acting in its own best interest and buying oil from Russia.
So, how did India get those tariffs reduced? Well, the source makes a very direct accusation. It claims India was essentially pressured into what it calls a forced deal, agreeing to buy almost $500 billion worth of American defense and aviation gear over the next decade.
But it's not just about the money. The argument goes deeper, accusing the U.S. of a divide-and-rule strategy right in India's own neighborhood. It points to alleged U.S. involvement in destabilizing governments in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, all while, get this,
giving shelter to anti-India separatists on its own soil and continuing its decades-long military support for Pakistan. The whole point, according to the source, is to keep India bogged down with regional squabbles so it can't become a real global power.
So, after going through this whole timeline of events laid out by the source, we finally get to its big conclusion, the final verdict on this so-called ally.
So what's the big takeaway here? The source material is basically saying this isn't a history of a few random disagreements. It's a consistent pattern that stretches for decades. In public, you hear the language of partnership, of friendship, but in private, the actions are allegedly all about pressure, control, and obstruction.
To really capture this deep feeling of betrayal, our source uses a powerful Hindi saying, "Aisa koi saga nahi, jise America ne thaga nahi." It roughly translates to, "There is no relative whom America has not deceived." And for the source, that one line sums up its entire argument perfectly.
So if that's the problem, what's the solution? The source concludes that there's really only one way forward for India, Atmanirbhar, or complete self-reliance. It argues that the only real shield that can protect a nation from an enemy who shows up disguised as a friend is total independence, military, technological, and economic.
And that brings us full circle, right back to the beginning. After laying out the entire case from our source material, the question is now for you to think about. Based on this perspective, is the USA a true friend to India, or is it a very, very clever enemy?